Okay, so, remember those crazy New York tabloid headlines back in the day? 1986, MTV was king, everybody had big hair, and then bam, there's this murder. Shocked the city, became an absolute media frenzy. They called it the Preppy Murder.
Yeah.
Young love gone wrong, all that, in the world of Manhattan's elite. Super fascinating. Today, we're going to try to figure out what really went down, separate fact from fiction. We're doing a deep dive into the Robert Chambers and Jennifer Levin case. And we're using some things from the You're Wrong About podcast to kind of guide us.
Yeah, and it's crazy, right? Out of all the murders in New York that year, over 1,500 of them, this is the one that just grabbed everyone's attention. It wasn't just a crime. It was like this whole story that tapped into all these anxieties people had about like wealth and privilege, the idea that some people are untouchable and can get away with anything.
Yeah, totally. It had everything, right? A young woman dead in Central Park, a good-looking, privileged guy accused, and then all the rumors and finger-pointing. So who were these people? Let's start with Robert Chambers. He seemed to be living the preppy dream, but something else was going on there. The podcast goes into his childhood. His mom was really ambitious, wanted to climb that social ladder, and his dad struggled with alcohol. Sounds like a tough environment to grow up in.
Yeah, and there were red flags early on. Like he started stealing from his classmates at age 10, and it just escalated from there. Burglaries, credit card theft, then substance abuse, big time, and all this before he even finished high school, and there weren't really any consequences, which just feeds into this image of someone who was trying to control his life any way he could. Felt like a pawn, maybe?
It's like he was stuck in this cycle of destructive stuff, always trying to be someone he wasn't. Now, Jennifer Levin, she was in the same circles as Robert, but she had her own story, right? The You're Wrong About podcast uses a few sources, including this book, Wasted, to paint a picture of her. She was independent, trying to figure out societal expectations of women and all that, looking for connection.
And this is important. Jennifer was more than just a victim. The media, unfortunately, got fixated on her sex diary, they called it. And that pushed all these victim-blaming narratives. We can't forget that a woman's history never justifies violence against her. Jennifer had dreams, a whole life ahead of her, that was tragically cut short.
Yeah, it's a reminder that behind the headlines and all the hype, these were real people with their own struggles and hopes, and the events leading up to, the murder were tense. The podcast talks about that night at Dorian's Red Hand, a bar on the Upper East Side. Robert was caught between Jennifer, who was coming on to him, and his girlfriend, who was angry.
And it's important to note that Robert and Jennifer already knew each other. They ran in the same circles. The sources suggest there was some flirtation, maybe a bit of a power dynamic even. That night at Dorian's, it all kind of exploded.
Okay, so let's talk about that night in Central Park. Robert said it was an accident, that Jennifer died during rough sex, but they both agreed to it. But the You're Wrong About podcast really picks apart that claim.
Yeah, the physical evidence, her injuries, just didn't match his story. Strangulation is violent, it's intentional. It wasn't rough sex gone wrong like the defense tried to say later. The evidence pointed somewhere else entirely.
And don't forget, he first said the scratches on his face were from a cat. That just shows how desperate he was to downplay what happened.
Right. It's this pattern of denial and relying on his privilege to get him out of trouble. We see this all through his life, from the stealing to the drugs. It's like he thought he could talk his way out of anything.
And then we get to the media storm around the trial.
Oh, yeah. This was 1986, no internet yet, but the tabloids went crazy. They latched on to this Preppy murder story and blew it way out of proportion. It became all about Jennifer's personal life and not about holding Robert accountable. The whole thing turned into a symbol of class warfare in the city, with lots of people believing that Robert was getting special treatment because his family was wealthy and well-connected.
Ugh, it's frustrating. The focus went from, a life being taken to judging the victim's choices. This case shows how the media can completely shape public opinion. It's so easy to lose sight of what really matters. So the trial goes on, and eventually they reach a plea deal.
And that's where the privilege really shows up. Even with all the evidence, he doesn't get a murder conviction, pleads guilty to manslaughter, gets 5 to 15 years.
A lot of people felt that sentence wasn't nearly enough. 5 to 15 years for taking someone's life. It just reinforced that feeling that wealth can buy you leniency in the justice system.
Yeah, and that disparity, like that feeling that the scales of justice aren't balanced, it's skewed, right? That's what really got people riled up. This case, it wasn't just about Jennifer, it became this symbol of class and privilege in New York. Like, Could a preppy kid actually get away with murder? That was the big question.
It's almost like that label, preppy. It became this shield, right? It deflected all the attention away from the real issues, all those things, the stealing, the drugs, the risky behavior. It was almost like expected, just boys being boys because of his background.
And it makes you think, right? Like, how do we assign meaning to these labels? Do we give people a pass, maybe unconsciously, just because they fit a certain mold,
Mm.
even when their actions are, well, they're not okay? The You're Wrong About podcasts, they really dig into that. The media, they played a huge role in this, the term preppy murder.
Yeah.
It just grabs you. It's like this world most people can only imagine, and it creates a distance. We forget about the real violence, the human cost.
So true. We have to be careful. We can't just take what the media says at face value. It's too easy to get swept up in all the drama and forget that there are real people at the heart of it all.
Absolutely. And then on the other hand, Jennifer Levin, she was reduced to a caricature. The media, they focused on her sexuality, that so-called sex diary. It was like they were trying to say she was somehow asking for it.
Yeah, classic victim blaming. It happens all the time, and it's just not right. They should have been focusing on Robert and holding him accountable.
Exactly. And let's go back to that confession of his. The story he told about that night in Central Park, the accidental strangulation, it just doesn't hold water.
The physical evidence, the injuries, it just doesn't add up. Strangulation is a deliberate act. It doesn't just happen accidentally, especially not during consensual sex.
The podcast hosts, they point out that the defense, their strategy was basically to slut shame Jennifer, make her look promiscuous, so maybe the jury would think she was responsible for what happened to her.
Awful. It shows how our biases can creep into, like, even the courtroom.
And that whole thing about the scratches being from a cat. Come on. Insulting.
Desperation. He just couldn't deal with the consequences. His whole life, he'd been dodging responsibility, using his family's name and money to get out of trouble. And even with all the evidence staring him in the face, he couldn't change.
A tragic cycle. And in the end, it led to more suffering. Not just for Jennifer and her family, but for Robert, too. After prison, he kept using drugs, got arrested for dealing. It's like he never really escaped the things that led to that night in Central Park.
It makes you think about our approach to justice. Is it enough to just punish people? Shouldn't we also be trying to help them, fix the things that lead them to crime in the first place?
This case really shows us that we need a different approach, a better one. Punishment isn't enough. We need to deal with addiction, with trauma, with mental health. If we want to break the cycle, help people turn their lives around.
It's complicated for sure. But this deep dive has shown us how important it is to ask those hard questions. We need to look at our own biases, fight for a system that's truly fair for everyone.
I agree with you 100%. This case, as sad as it is, it makes us think, how can we learn from this? How can we make a future where justice is actually blind, where we care about fixing people as much as we care about punishing them? That's what we need to be talking about.
Powerful stuff. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. And to everyone listening, keep exploring these issues, keep having those conversations, and don't be afraid to question the stories that we're told.
Right. Knowledge is power, but only when we use it to make things better.
Going through all this, the thing that really gets me is how powerful stories are. The media, they created this preppy murder narrative, and it took on a life of its own. It's like the name itself became part of the whole thing, right? And it changed how people saw it, everything, the people involved, even what happened in the end.
Yeah, it's like the You're Wrong About podcast says the word preppy. It comes with all these ideas, doesn't it? Wealth, exclusivity, like being out of touch with reality. And it made it easier for people to distance themselves from the actual murder, you know what I mean? It became this story about those people, not about the real messed up stuff that leads to these tragedies.
And it wasn't just the media, right? Like, even in the trial, Robert's lawyers, they kind of used that same story. They made him seem like a good kid from a good family who just got caught up in something bad.
Totally. They were saying it was an accident, a mistake, like he was a victim too. They talked about his potential, his future, but they didn't really talk about him being the one who, did the violent act.
And his family, their money, their connections, it all played a role in how people saw him, right? And maybe even how the justice system treated him.
For sure. The sentence, 5 to 15 years, it was a joke to a lot of people. They saw it as proof that the system is rigged, that if you have money and connections, you can get away with, well, almost anything.
It's hard to accept, And then, after all that, he still ended up going down a bad path. It's just sad.
Yeah, his life after prison, the addiction, the arrest for dealing drugs, it shows that the real problems were never fixed. It's like he was stuck, couldn't break free from those same patterns that led him to that night in Central Park.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, is it enough to just punish someone?
Hmm.
Maybe we should be focusing more on helping them, getting to the root of the problem.
This case really shows us that we need a new approach to justice, a better one. Just punishing people without dealing with the deeper stuff, the addiction, the trauma, it doesn't work. We got to break that cycle, you know? Help people rebuild their lives instead of just locking them up.
It's a complex issue, no doubt. But this deep dive, it's been eye-opening. It's shown us the ugly side of privilege, how stories can be twisted, and how messed up our justice system can be.
It makes us think about our own biases, right? It
Yeah.
makes us want to fight for a world where everyone is treated fairly. It's about asking those tough questions, having those uncomfortable conversations, and working to create a system that actually cares about fixing people and giving them second chances.
Well said. Lot to think about after this deep dive. To everyone listening, keep exploring these issues, talk about them, and don't just accept the stories you're told. Okay, question them. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with another deep dive, something new to explore. Until then, stay curious and keep those minds working.